I'm therefore going to start us. Hello and welcome to the National Association of Scholars webinar on the age of automation. I'm David Randall, your moderator and director of research for the National Association of Scholars, and I'm delighted to be able to present three distinguished panelists in alphabetical order by last name. Dr. Dan Albert holds a PhD in history from the University of Michigan, and among his many books are Silent Victories, The History and Practice of Public Health in 20th Century America, and Are We There Yet? The American Automobile, Past, Present, and Driverless. Dr. John Heitman has taught a wide variety of courses in the history of science and technology and environmental history at the University of Dayton since 1984. Among his books, Stealing Cars, Technology and Society from the Model T to the Gran Torino. And thirdly, Dr. Tom Lewis, Professor Emeritus of English at Skidmore, and among his books are Empire of the Air, The Men Who Made Radio, and also Divided Highways, the Interstate Highway System and the Transformation of American Life. Now, these professors have a number of fine books, which you should all read with Amazon links. I am actually going to try to put them into the chat button at the bottom for everybody. If they don't come there properly, then they will go. Actually, no, I can't do them properly. Never mind. Our alternate host is going to put them into the chat button properly. But the point being, there is a chat button and a Q&A button at the bottom. So number one is, once we've finished our three 12 to 14 minute talks by our three panelists, happily conversational, then you, the audience, get to put in your questions, and indeed start them beforehand. Please put in your questions in the chat or Q&A buttons. I'll be delighted to pass them along to our panelists. They're also free to read them themselves and answer directly, as well as talk directly with one another. You should not worry if your questions don't get answered in the course of the 90 minutes. Any questions that are left hanging, and I answer them in any order that seems conversational, and sometimes I even introduce my own, send your questions to me at randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org, and I will be delighted to forward them to the panelists so they can have the option to reply to you. Also, don't worry if you have to leave before our session is over. This is all going to be recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. So you'll be able to see this in perpetuity and send it to your friends. Having said all that, let's go directly. Dr. Albert, may I ask if you would speak first?
I am alphabetically first. I will. I appreciate your thinking of me for this, and I'm going to be, I hope, relatively brief, keep it into my 12 minutes, got my timer, because really I'm more interested in listening to Tom and John and hearing the conversation than sort of what I have to say. I'm going to jump right into something a little scary, which is to say, talk about the culture wars. And I want to talk about the Model T, the history of the Model T, the history of the electric vehicle. And in particular, I want to connect that to the electric vehicle and the pickup truck, the modern day versions. Because I think each of those vehicles, the Model T and the very early EVs, have we understand their history in a way that informs the way we think about modern EVs and pickup trucks. But a lot of that history is not quite right, and certainly the realities of those vehicles today are somewhat different than we might think. So I'm going to assume people have heard of the Model T. It is known for being very simple, very inexpensive, also very much a rural car, farmer's car, and that's what Henry Ford always talked about. And also this idea of volume, of course. It was 14 million produced. So it was very democratizing, if you will. So, the U.S. is always thought of as the car culture. The reality is we're the car culture because we got there first. And We had the diversity of income, or the income spread, where people could afford these cars. It's also part of its ethos was, in terms of being rural, and in terms of Henry Ford himself, was very much anti-globalist, isolationist, if I can use those kind of modern terms. And Henry Ford was, at one point, briefly a candidate for president. Polls showed him second only to Mussolini as the most popular man around the globe. So those things are there, and talk about them a little bit in terms of the pickup truck. Now, the interesting things about electric vehicles is they predate internal combustion vehicles. They were very quickly sort of feminized, and in a lot of ways very much more practical, very much better vehicles than internal combustion vehicles around the turn of the last century. So if you think of a Model T, this was a very tall, tippy, open vehicle. It was hard to get started. You had to constantly adjust things. Shifting gears on a Model T was pretty easy, but most internal combustion cars of the day were just difficult to drive, had to constantly be maintained. By contrast, with an EV, just like today, you flip a switch and you're going. There is no grease. There is none of that maintenance. And I think kind of the epitome of that is Henry Ford bought his wife Clara a Detroit Electric in 1914. And I'd encourage you to go to the Henry Ford Museum, where you can, online, where you can look around the inside of her car. And it looks like a drawing room, and it's tufted upholstery. It has little crystal vases with flowers, and it was enclosed. It was glassed in, and the passengers and the driver, they sat facing one another. So it was really like, they were sitting and having tea, and oh yes, happened to be moseying along in their car. To just ease to the modern idea, two things I think really epitomize this, if you will, culture war. And I'm just going to read this. So recently, there's been a lot of push to eliminate the tax credits for electric vehicles, and even impose new fees on electric vehicles. And this is and again, it's sort of a broad, but this is my favorite one. This was a bill introduced by John Barrasso of Wyoming, and a senator, and in the House, a fellow named John Smith from Missouri. And it is called the Eliminate Lavish Incentives to Electric Vehicles Act, ELITE. And Smith, I'm sorry, it's Jason Smith. He said he wanted to stop the taxpayer-funded slush fund for coastal elites. It shouldn't be hardworking Missouri farmers supporting these Tesla owners out in California. And so that, again, that's kind of amusing, but that's very much the reality of that one side of the coin. And then the other side of the coin is where the EV people talk about, gas guzzlers and how awful the automobile is, and how they're going to drive an electric in order to sort of save the world. So I don't want anybody trying to deduce my politics, because my politics are really about, reading the footnotes and overcoming ignorance. So let me start a little bit with the with some of the early period vehicles, and really get back to the Model T. So Model T debuted in 1908, October 1908, 1909 is really the first full year of production. In a lot of ways, it was a great car, and much better than what was available. Ford used some new steel alloys. It made it very rugged. There were some innovations. He did what's called an en bloc or solid 4-cylinder engine. At the time, most engines were 2 cylinders, 2 separate castings, and then bolted together. The head of the engine, the top part would come off for servicing, which was another thing that was not readily available. I talked about shifting. Shifting gears, it had what was called a band transmission, and that was great for people who had never driven before, which was pretty much everybody who got a Model T because they didn't have a car. It had what's known as a three-point suspension. The whole car was extraordinarily light, and would be able to flex on these really rut-filled roads of the rural, the farmland. So a lot of interesting innovations, and very much a great car, a great piece of technology. On the other hand, there's a certain a lot of mythology around it. It was certainly, and Ford's ethos was very much about no frills, nothing fancy on here. And you've probably heard the famous phrase, any color as long as it's black. And that's an apocryphal term. He never actually said that. It makes no sense. But it is true that he did not believe in, gussying things up and a new model year and colors and all of that. He felt like this is the car. This is all you need. You don't need anything fancier. So, leave me alone. On the other hand, it was a crummy car. Like if you could afford something else, you bought something else, right? It very quickly became a poor man's car, if you will. And it's interesting, talk about reading the footnotes. A lot of this is evidence bias. So we tend to believe a lot about the Model T that isn't true, and it has to do with who collected the information. And if you begin to read a wider variety of sources, you hear a lot of people saying, God, this was an awful car. I was just reading Harpo Marx's autobiography, and he talks about his experience with the Model T. And he drives from one town to the next, it breaks down, and he sells it for junk. I have some wonderful letters of a couple that went from Michigan to California in their Model T, and she writes home and says, I will never do that trip again, certainly not a Ford. So there were a lot of people that were unhappy with it, and it was also very quickly antiquated. A lot of vehicles surpassed it very quickly. So I'm going to jump, and I'm trying to move through a lot of material. But I want to talk a little bit about the early EV, and I want to make it clear that the internal combustion versus the EV, you can't say one is better than the other, right? Just like you can't say a pigeon is better than a goldfish just because a goldfish can't fly. If you want to live in the water, pigeon's no good for you. So in the very early days, the electric vehicle outpaced the internal combustion car, but it didn't serve the needs, the thing that people wanted and what the market would support. Now, very early on, the most successful electric vehicles were actually part of what you now call a mobility as service company. You sort of think of Uber or something. This was the electric vehicle company. They were very successful. They had a sustainable business model. They collapsed for a variety of reasons, particularly stock watering, and also the editor of something called the Horseless Age, who really believed in internal combustion engines, really torpedoed them. He called them the lead cab trust. But as a technology, a lot of upfront costs, right? Much more expensive upfront. And as I said, it quickly becomes a niche vehicle for wealthy women in particular. And a lot of the reason for that is because, as practical as it was, particularly in the cities, it wasn't a bicycle. And by that I mean, just preceding the explosion of the automobile is a real bicycle cricket. And people are using bicycles for the most part for fun. It's awesome. If you've never had a bicycle and then you get on a bicycle and you're suddenly flying along. So that's what people did, and they went out touring into the countryside. And that's what a lot of what the automobile was in the early days. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense. You don't need an automobile for transportation because the whole world's kind of set up pre-automobile, if you will. And the other one, speaking about that, I'm just going to read a quick quote. There was around 1900, 1902, magazine called The Electric World described the problem of the electric automobile. And he put it, and I'll just read the quote, Even if you had chargers, like we talk about having now chargers everywhere, even if you had chargers, one does not want to limit his country tour to lines of travel along which he can strike charging facilities. And that's, of course, what we're talking about now. This idea of putting in lots of chargers along the highways. So, I sort of go back to that and think about now, what do people actually want in a car? So now very quickly, if we jump ahead, we get into this period, I'm going to call it between the 1970s and the 1990s, where we think of an electric vehicle as sort of an environmental hair shirt. You wear it because you want to be environmental, and you put up with a lot of limitations. And by the same token, by the 1990s, the government of California is pushing zero emission vehicles. So it's a government sponsored vehicle, if you will. What happened with Tesla and what's happened recently is it's no longer about that. It's no longer a vehicle you buy just because you're an environmentalist. It's a vehicle people are buying because it's a better vehicle buying and owning experience for a lot of people. And in fact, what they're being sold on is their performance. Tesla 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. The Ford F-150 Lightning being sold as for its acceleration. I'm already too long. I will. Last thing I will say is, again, we think of the pickup truck as going to the Model T as a simple, solid American body-on-frame vehicle. I have one. I drive an F-150. It's a 2007. It has a bench seat, crank windows, and an 8-foot bed. Those are really hard to come by now. The modern pickup truck is a luxury vehicle, sells for, on average, more than 60 grand. It has 4 doors. It has 5 seats and maybe a 6-foot bed, so kind of useless bed. And so in a lot of ways, the Model T ethos is sort of what the vehicle is still sold on, but not at all what the vehicle is. So as usual, I have too much. I've said too much. I will stop, and hopefully we can talk about this more.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Professor Heitman, may I ask if you would go next?
Sure. I'd like to begin just by taking a little bit of a paragraph from my book, The Automobile in American Life. Am I gone here? No.
No, sorry, you muted yourself for a second there, but you should be back on now.
I see David Randall on my screen, but I'm on your screen?
Yes.
Okay. First, I do want to emphasize the importance of the automobile, particularly in understanding the 20th century. But I'm not so sure about the 21st century. It's significant, and it could be very significant, and particularly in the global sense. But when it comes to one piece of technology that has the machine that changed the world, as one book of the early 1990s uses a title, the automobile and its related infrastructure transformed everyday life as well as our basic values. From top to bottom in American society, it created wealth and jobs. It played a crucial role in transforming Americans from producers of a limited number of goods to mass production, manufacturers, and consumers living in a machine age. It influenced, among other things, the nature and structure of the communities in which we live, how we define and value community, and the architectural styles of our homes and other living spaces. Over the course of the 20th century, the car whetted our appetite for new things conveying status and personal attractiveness. Petroleum-based energy sources, engaging action movies, primal rock and roll music, and high-fat, fast food. So I'm just throwing out this notion of just how important this topic really is. I want to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions and some of the insights that await a critical reexamination, however, of the automobile, including the reinterpretation of early EV history that Dr. Albert referred to. One of the first questions I ask my students to mull over is the question of who invented the automobile. Who did invent the automobile? Occasionally, someone will say it's Henry Ford, and we have learned quite a bit about Henry Ford from Dr. Albert in the last few minutes. Of course, that's a total misconception. As many people have cited, the automobile is European by birth and American by adoption. We can go back all the way to the 17th century and steam carriages. We can look at steam cars, EVs, electric vehicles at the end of the 19th century. We can look at the internal combustion engine, the winner in the competition that took place amongst various technologies at the beginning of the 20th century. The list of names is endless. But one thing is clear, it was not Henry Ford who invented the automobile. And I think so many Americans think that it was Henry Ford. Well, it could have been Carl Benz. It could have been a fellow by the name of Daimler. It could have been someone from France, from Brazil, from Spain. We could go on and on. And so it just shows you the complexities of this situation. And then enter into our story the significance of the elusive personality in history. And if there ever was an elusive personality, it was Henry Ford. Was he a complex individual who appeared to many of us looking at it in the past through our reading, or those who were alive at the time as a rather simple a farm boy from rural Michigan, or was he a simple individual who appeared to be very complex? Much has been written on Henry Ford. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, and in fact, he had the great vision of understanding a market. I often have told my students, if you really want to be a success in business, in the American marketplace, if you can read the market, the world is in your hands. And that's what Henry Ford did. Yes, he was mechanically gifted. He could have essentially gone into the watchmaking business, but he didn't. He could have stayed with Detroit Edison and was greatly influenced by Thomas Edison, but he went into the carriage and internal combustion engine business. And after several failures in 1903, along with a number of individuals, set up the Ford Motor Company. One thing that's very clear about the history of the Model T is Henry Ford did not invent the Model T. He understood where the markets were. He understood that Americans, common Americans, as Professor Albert was talking about, the people who wanted a car that could do many things, this Tin Lizzie, the everyday folks, the farmers, they wanted a car like the Model T. And he understood that. He also understood metallurgy and things like vanadium alloys. But the people who put together the Model T and who made the assembly line possible, yes, Henry Ford was there, and Henry Ford watched things. Henry Ford suggested changes. Henry Ford brought in a vast array of talented people to his organization. People like Sorensen and Knudsen and Wills and Carl Emde. Those were the people who ultimately did this thing called the assembly line that came to be in 1914. The Model T, actually, yes, it was first made available in 1908, but not really on an assembly line as we understand it until 1914. What can be said new about Henry Ford? I think as I was just putting my ideas together, Henry Ford essentially drove for control. He was always interested in controlling whatever situation that might be. His automobile was, I think, a part of a vision of reshaping America in his image, which was a 19th century image, okay? It wasn't a 20th century image at all. And so he's an example of an inventor who created a world that he wasn't particularly comfortable in. So that was a part of the story. He wanted to control the stockholders of the Henry Ford organization, the Ford Motor Company. That took about 15 years before he essentially bought out all of the minority stockholders, caused considerable amount of conflict at times, but he did so by the early 1920s. So that was an element of control. He had to also remember, initially his automobile was assembled from parts. Yes, the design was actually the design of one of his employees by the name of Wills, but it was put together by parts made by other individuals, and particularly in terms of engines, the Dodge brothers, John and Horace Dodge. And lawsuits involving the Dodges and essentially eliminating the Dodges from stockholding in the Ford Motor Company was a major concern of his going through to the period right after World War I. So he learned about suppliers. And one of the things he did to control supply was that he ended up building the Rouge and vertically integrating his entire operation by the 1920s, where essentially iron ore, coal, and wood come into the Rouge, and cars go out. And the cars after 1927 were no longer Model Ts, but boy, he held on to Model Ts until nobody wanted to buy them anymore. And the price reduction didn't make a difference because Americans had become wealthier and they wanted something more than this hunka tin, okay? I think if there's anything about Ford, it was control. It was control of his son, Edsel. It was control of his organization. That's a very important part of the Ford story. And I wanted to make sure folks were aware of that. Yes, it was a magnificent car in the hands of many rural Americans. It was relatively rugged, but it wasn't as rugged as what some literature makes it out to be. He had a rather unusual transmission, and that transmission often was terribly unreliable, often had to be repaired 2 or 3 times during a long trip, and would only be essentially replaced with a sliding type transmission with the Model A that came out in 1928. So we could talk more about T. We could talk more about the T and its influence. Now, how am I doing for time? Am I out?
It's 2:29. If you wanted to do another minute or two, I think it would be reasonable.
All right. I think one thing about Henry Ford that we might want to deal with is let's compare Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company with Tesla and the Tesla organization. Okay. Henry Ford had a democratic vision of his market, and he essentially built his car from the bottom up in terms of the marketplace. Low prices going up. Elon Musk took a long time to get going. Ford moved very quickly. Musk took years from 2006, then on to the Elise, And he essentially has built his organization from the top down, taking a long amount of time to do it, and with really no supplier issues compared to Ford. The question I ask of both of these individuals, and I'll challenge the audience to look into this, is how did distraction essentially move Henry Ford away from the automobile business after 1915 or so, and how is distraction now possibly going to influence Musk and Tesla? And that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm going to ask then for our third speaker, Dr. Lewis.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for moderating. And thanks also to Chris Kendall, who's very much in the background, for arranging this. And I wanted to talk about American attitudes about cars, but through the lens of the interstate highway system. And beyond that, talk about the American attitudes towards technology and what our future is for the highways. The question that was put before me is, how did the interstate highway system develop? And was it built to accommodate cars of the day? Or were cars modified to make overland travel more feasible? To take the latter part of that question first, what was the interstate built to accommodate cars of the day, or were cars modified to make overland travel more feasible? The answer is that by 1956, the automobile had changed pretty dramatically, starting about 1939 with the advent of the Hydra-matic, the automatic transmission system, which was adopted first by GM, but later, and especially after the war, by Ford and Chrysler. The Pennsylvania Turnpike opened in 1940, which accommodated cars. And remember, the speed limit was 70 miles an hour there. That was when they put a speed limit on. It was unlimited for the first few months. The World's Fair of 1939 showed Americans what might happen in the future. It was the world of tomorrow in the GM Pavilion, where Norman Bell Geddes, the great set designer for Broadway, took his talents to highways and created the world of tomorrow, where people actually rode over in seats, looked down on the United States and what an interstate highway would look like as it traveled across the country, and then landed them, interestingly enough, at the end, right at the GM cars at the very end. So yes, the highways did accommodate cars that were being built. But the other part of the question, how did the highway develop, also has a short answer to start with. The interstate highway developed, I think, basically because Americans needed a safe way and a congestion-free way of travel. And that need had been building for some time. By 1929, these are kind of interesting facts. By 1929, 1 in every 4 Americans had a car. By 1956, the year the interstate highway system was signed into law by President Eisenhower, 3/4 of American families had at least one automobile. The turnpikes, which had begun in Pennsylvania, spread to New Jersey, Maine, New Hampshire, Ohio, and New York. All those superhighways created a desire for better highways across America. Levitt towns, that is the growth of suburbias, had grown dramatically after the Second World War. So what had happened was, by 1956, Americans saw their passport to the American dream, which they were trying to realize. They saw it in the automobile. By 1956, the Korean War was in the rearview mirror. And so there was plenty of pent-up buying power. Some of it had been released after the Second World War, but it had been curbed again in the Korean War. But by 1953, the imposition of restrictions on manufacturing of US goods not for the war had been lifted. So manufacturers switched to the production of goods for consumers. The development of the interstate highway system meant a parallel development for every other supporting industry: steel mills, cement plants, bulldozer operators, gravel contractors, companies like GM, Alice Chalmers, Cat, Ingersoll Rand, even a company like Pittsburgh Paint or a 3M, if you think about it, got in on the actions. Pittsburgh Paint supplying the paint for the highway striping. GM or 3M supplying the materials for highway signs. All of these were a result of the Interstate Highway Bill. By 1956, there was this vast highway lobby, a lobby that included engineers, the American Association of Highway Officials, ASHO was there. The manufacturers that I just mentioned all were part of the lobby, and truckers were part of the lobby. In 1956, finally, I want to say there's a question of safety. And I think this is important to understand. People were getting worried about the death on the highways. In 1956, it was about 38,000 people died on the highways in America. But it was 6 per 100 million miles of travel. That is 6 deaths per 100 million miles of travel. 6 people were losing their lives. Today, in 2020 or so, the number is at about 39,000 deaths, but of course, congestion and automobile travel is up dramatically, and the number of deaths per 100 million miles of travel has been reduced to 1 1/3 person. So a dramatic decrease. All of this is part of the development of the interstate highway system. And of course, figures lie and liars figure. There are many other parts of that equation. Safety of automobiles. The seatbelt hadn't been installed in an automobile until Ford did it, I believe, in 1957. Airbags and the like, as well as advances in modern medicine and the way one even gets transported to a hospital. But there's a more complex answer behind the word develop that I think is important. And develop is a metaphor, and it can be taken in a photographic sense, which I think is perhaps more important for this conversation. And the image that becomes available to us after a photograph is taken is one that is changing over time. So if you think about it, an image is there, it's latent, but we begin to see it over time. And of course, what we have in the interstate highway system, which began in '56 and really concluded, if you will, by the year 2000, is a revelation of ourselves, which is never fixed and always changing. It shows our strengths and our weaknesses. The strength, one of our strengths is that nothing can stop us as a people, especially after the Second World War, we thought that. The weakness, of course, is that we couldn't recognize our limits, so that if nothing was too great a challenge. So if we want to go through the Bristol Mountains in California, why not set off 22 nuclear bombs to blow up the mountains? A plan that was advanced by the Federal Highway Administration, and only to the point where they had had designs for the reviewing stand where people could watch the explosions, and was only stopped when the agricultural department said, wait a second, you're going to create a permanent Krakatoa that will last for years and disrupt our crop production, not to mention the nuclear fallout. That is part of our weakness. The interstate highway system, the development is the triumph of crossing the mountains. Triumph of crossing the country is very, very important. But there's also the failure to not understand that you couldn't drive highways into ancient cities that had roads and streets built for horses and wagons and impose superhighways on a place like Boston or Philadelphia or New York. And I think there's another failure, and that is we have had, of course, a wonderful triumph of federal and state partnership in the highway, developing the highway system. And yet we have failed to support it with our taxes. If you consider the federal highway tax, which began, interestingly enough, with the imposition of a 1-cent tax by President Hoover's administration in 1932, and has been gradually raised to 18.4 cents today, I believe. And we think about that in the context of the fact that that inflation has taken Mr. Hoover's penny and made it worth 22 cents today. So our federal highway tax doesn't even keep pace with the cost of inflation. And yet our highways are deteriorating along with the rest of our infrastructure. And all of this really began in 1987, when Ronald Reagan vetoed the first interstate highway and transportation bill. It was overridden by Congress, but it was a signal of what was to come. So if you think about it, by 1986, about the time that Reagan vetoed that bill, we had divorced ourselves from our greatness. Think about the Erie Canal, 1825, Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, John Adams. They all joined John Quincy Adams in New York Harbor to celebrate the marriage of the waters. When DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, took a barrel of water from the Erie Canal and dumped it into the Atlantic. That was a great feat. President Arthur, Chester A. Arthur, inaugurated the Brooklyn Bridge. If you think about Whitman, talking of the strong late works of engineers, but then think about by the 1980s, the interstate highway system had become really a symbol of indifference, scorn, and embarrassment. And consider the last link of the interstate highway system built for Route 80, which crosses the country. That was the first transcontinental highway. The last link was in Salt Lake City. No one could come to visit it for the ribbon cutting. President Reagan wasn't there. His Secretary of Transportation, Elizabeth Dole, couldn't make it. She, by the way, is largely regarded as one of the worst secretaries of transportation. And the Secretary of the Federal Highway Administrator, Ray Barnard, wasn't there either. Nobody could quite make it. It was an assistant governor who cut the ribbon. That's a sad comment on what we think of technology. And it's where the development of the interstate highway system has come. Thank you.
Look, and thank you so much. So I'm going to encourage everybody, put your questions in.
I'm sorry. I just
sorry.
put in my earphones again.
Sorry. So to everybody, I say thank you to you, but everybody, please put in your questions. I'm actually going to pick up a bit. There was a question from Captain Nicholson, following up on Tesla. So you're going to the present, with the shortage of electricity in places like California and Japan, how can they hope to go to fully electric vehicles in the next dozen years? Dr. Albert had started with, it's a little more complicated than that. Electricity is not like a gasoline where you run out of gas and have a problem more later. So I want to build on this question. This question I'm taking builds on the idea that, indeed, for a network of electric cars, you need a very formidable infrastructure network. It is electricity production, electricity distribution, and that's just both the main lines of, and then to every house, and then the maintenance thereof, to speak nothing of batteries and so forth. Can you speak a little bit about what is necessary for the full complex setup of an electricity distribution network? And just to tie it in, talk a little bit about how this compares with building the gas network, which was necessary for the first Fordian automobile revolution. In 2 seconds or less.
I guess I'll jump in and I guess just a couple of seemingly random thoughts. One is when you talk about, okay, we're going to transition to EVs. I explained that the average vehicle is about 12 years old. About 20% of the vehicles are over 18 years old on the road today. Even if everybody tomorrow bought, the next car they bought was an electric vehicle, we have a generation before you turn the fleet over, right? In terms of sort of electricity and whether or not we have enough, it's the funny thing about electricity is certainly right now, and there's technology developing, but it's not something you store, right? So gasoline you could put under the ground, put it in a tank, pump it into your tank, and so forth. Electricity has to be made at the moment you need it for the most part. So one of the things that's complicated is you need what's called base load power, where there's enough power all the time. But it's funny. I lived in England, and there's a certain moment at about 4 o'clock where everybody turned on their tea kettle, and you need to have the power ready to turn on at that point. Well, nuclear power doesn't do that. You use natural gas and so forth. So the issue is not so much having enough electricity, but having electricity at the right time. And one of the arguments is if you charge electric vehicles at the right time of the day, say overnight, you actually balance out the load, and it makes it easier. There's another thing called network to grid or G2G grid, where essentially all those batteries in vehicles are your storage capacity for the whole network. And Japan is looking at this. It's very, very complicated. But again, you think of that issue of storage. One idea is that the vehicles themselves become a storage, become battery storage for the network. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, if I could fix the electric grid and all of that, 2 seconds or less, David, you said, I guess the one thing I would say is a lot of this is about the grid, and the grid is just not it's not integrated enough. It's not smart enough. And we saw in Texas, for example, Texas has its own grid. And when those ice storms hit, they were really stuck. So those are some of the issues.
If I may, is it a question of, do we have the technology and we just need the money and the proper regulations, knock on wood, or is there in point of fact also a technological revolution necessary to get enough of the grid in for electric cars, universal?
I mean, again, I would say the technology is already there. In terms of a smart grid, which is what a lot of people talk about being necessary, where The grid knows where the power is going and where it's coming from in a lot more sort of moment to moment way. That has to be deployed. But, you know, electric distribution systems are 120 plus years old. It's not that complicated. It's not something we can't do with the technology we have.
Thank you. Do either Dr. Lewis, Dr. Heitman, do either of you wish to speak to this?
My knowledge of electric cars is very limited, so I'm going to pass on this. It's something that's not there. I'm not especially worried about it in terms of the state that I live in, because I'm beginning to see an enormous number of charging stations. And my sense is that it will be, as the acquisition of cars that are electric powered is going to gradually come into a state like Maine, which has a considerable rural population. It's going to ultimately succeed because in the more populated area of Maine, where I happen to live, it's just remarkable the number of charging stations that have opened up in just a very short time. In my immediate neighborhood, there are 6. They're not 6 cars, but they're anticipating that there will be more than there will be. And I must say it's rather attractive right now because the charging is free, so not metered. But that's all my, so I guess I'm not as concerned about this as from my very parochial and limited perspective as perhaps I should be.
Thank you. Dr. Heitman.
Yeah, I think the big question is why EVs now? And of course, it's driven by climate change issues and the urgency of climate change. And that is a controversial question in its own right. And it is being driven by government that is doing much to promote EV use now and putting these EVs on the road, although there's plenty of questions about now American content of EVs and how that's going to fit into subsidies and all the rest. I think to some degree we're getting ahead of ourselves because the battery technology is not quite good enough yet. Battery technology, I think it'll be projected by the 2030s will be quite good, and then maybe game will be over in terms of ICE versus EVs. But it's not quite good enough yet. And so we're getting lots of push from government organizations and politicians into this mobility business. And I think the record of the automobile industry going back to the 1970s in terms of federal involvement in mandates related to the automobile is not a terribly positive story, okay, going back to the 70s. I think the question is how urgent is the climate matter? And then secondly, are we getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the technology? Are we moving too fast? And that's where I stand on this.
Maybe can I kind of follow up on what John had to say there?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think everything you say is very interesting. I guess just a couple of thoughts. One, you know, I talked about this idea of the environmental hair shirt idea. One of the things that's happened with EVs, and one of the, you know, I talked a little bit about the irony of the modern pickup and the Model T. The irony of the modern EV is it's very much not an EV. and it's very much non-environmentally friendly. And I want to be careful there. Because again, if we listen to the right, they'll talk about, and this is sort of a talking point from George Will had a column, they're 70% coal cars, because that's where the electricity is coming from. Well, that's not true, and they're definitely more carbon friendly and so forth than internal combustion cars. But they are not the hair shirt cars of the 1970s. In other words, the 1970s, the most popular or the best selling, and it wasn't that popular, electric car of the 1970s was something called the city car. And it looks like a doorstop. And it was top speed of 40 miles an hour, 40-mile range or something. You had to really want to do something for air pollution and gasoline problem to buy that car. And that was true right through the Nissan Leaf, which was the most popular car, electric car, around about 2010. But I think something like 250,000 of those, 500,000 worldwide have sold, which is just nothing. You sell about 90 to 100 million cars around the world a year. But what's happened is what Tesla showed everybody is you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the same car that the Americans have always wanted and always enjoyed, but just with a different drivetrain. And so that means that the EV will perpetuate the world that the internal combustion car has created. So, again, I said pigeon versus goldfish. Well, the EV was a goldfish in a pigeon's world, if you will. The modern EV has learned to fly. I'm stretching my metaphor, but that it's really very much an internal combustion car with another drivetrain. So we're basically perpetuating the system, the automobile system we have, and we'll continue to sell internal combustion cars. And the last thing is, one of the big revolutions from Tesla is not the drivetrain, but the fact that they're selling online and selling direct. And the other EV makers are doing that. And the incumbent automakers, the General Motors, the Volkswagen, really just have this enormous legacy of what they've done for again, over 125 years. And keeping up with that change is going to be tricky.
What I'm hearing, by the way, is that we'll know that electric cars have succeeded when we have drag races on dry canals in Los Angeles with Teslas.
Yep.
So anyway, that's what we're going to go to. I want to, however, shift to some of the other questions, which are talking about, the first automobile age. From John Lawrence Bush, could each of the speakers discuss resistance to the introduction of automobiles? Just to expand, it's not just a triumph story. People were presumably reluctant, and it's institutional reluctance, economic reluctance, cultural reluctance. Can you talk about that resistance, and how that resistance then formed the history of the first automobile age? Jenny and all.
Well, I guess I can talk about it.
Sure.
It was the devil wagon. Initially, the automobile was the devil wagon during the first decade of the 20th century. There was plenty of resistance, particularly on the part of rural Americans who resented these city folks, because remember, the initial decade of the 20th century, the car was a luxury. It wasn't a necessity. And so you have urbanites who are going out in the countryside, they're picking your corn, they're essentially making a mess near your fields, and so there was rural resistance. Let's put wires across roads and teach these folks a lesson. Lots of resistance, and there was also resistance related to speed, or what was called scorching, but that changed once Henry Ford came up with a Model T. Because once the automobile was no longer a luxury, but it was perceived to be a necessity after, say, 1909, 1908, then all of a sudden that resistance began to wither away. Now, there's always been a cadre of those who resist the automobile. They've been around every decade. You can dig them up and find them. And accidents, Tom had made mention of the accident rate the nut behind the wheel, that driver behind the wheel who is causing accidents. But once that automobile becomes a necessity, then that resistance becomes a sort of narrowed down to a small group of contrarians, right? And how can you argue against all the things that this automobile will bring? It breaks the isolation of the rural America. You know, in 1900, most Americans never got more than 12 miles from their home. All right. Now, all of a sudden, they can travel. They can break the bounds of railroad oppression related to market rates of their goods. There's lots that can happen. So I think, but that resistance, there was resistance there, a significant resistance for some time, because it's about change. And many Americans don't want to change.
Yeah, and John's absolutely right. You know, there's a wonderful book, The Devil Wagon in God's Country, and it's very much about that. My favorite is a cartoon in there, and I'm sure you guys know it, where a car hits a little old lady, little farm lady standing in the street. And, you know, the automobilist smashes right into her, and of course, it's a farmer who's put a costume on a rock. You know, so that resistance is very much there in the rural area. It's also, and John referenced wires across the road. There's in Germany an example where it was really like a piano wire across the road, and someone was beheaded in their automobile. But there's also this huge urban resistance, and I actually talk a lot about this in my book. It's very much in that early day about rich people colonizing the streets. So you have to understand that in the pre-auto age, the streets were open spaces for playing, for, you know, push carts and business and all kinds of things, and they became car conduits, and they were killing, these drivers were killing a lot of children. And so there are examples of police shootouts with drivers, you know, with people in neighborhoods, drivers being stoned, because, you know, these people were the super rich, and they were going into these working class neighborhoods, and they were killing kids who, you know, played on the street, because where else would you play when you live in a tenement, sort of thing. So there was huge resistance. But John's also right. I always sort of think everybody was against the car until they got a car.
Well, I could just add a little bit to that, which is that the highway system, as we think of it, where you go from one state to another on the same highway, and maybe the number changes and maybe the surface changes, that's something that wasn't always the case. One state would build a highway up to its border, and another state would build a highway maybe 5 miles away up to its border. It was the nationalization of the highways which overcame a great deal of that sort of resistance. But the other point that was made about rich people coming into neighborhoods is kind of interesting from an interstate highway perspective, because that's exactly what was the question about driving interstate highways into urban areas, because you had the opportunity to, and the lines of the roads took them through disadvantaged neighborhoods, what were called slums at the time. And that was called, for the engineers at the time, a twofer. You got rid of the slum and you got a highway in its place. Nobody was concerned about where those people went. That was much of Moses's MO in his creation of highways around New York City. By the time of the interstate highway driving into, say, Washington, D.C., the protesters are getting up at meetings and saying, I do not want you to drive a white man's car through through a black man's bedroom, and that's what you're doing. That was the great question. So there's always been this give and take and this resistance. And I realize that takes the story a little bit further up, but to the present, but it's, I think, nevertheless an important part of the story.
Thank you. I want to just have a shout out to a science fiction author, R.A. Lafferty, who has an alternate history, Interurban Queen, about the development of electric trolleys instead of cars in the early 20th century. I recommend it to all. I'm going to go from there to actually an environmental question of my own, where the preface is the Brazilians have had a horrendous time, as I understand it, building a highway network in the jungle. The Russians have had an equally horrendous time going through the permafrost and the tundra. To what extent is America blessed in its environment to be able to create an interstate system, a highway system, relatively easily? And to what extent is our highway system, our automobile age, still governed by having to build cars and highways across a fairly broad variety of environments, Florida to, Montana or Alaska, depending on how you put it. It's still a pretty broad stretch of environmental conditions for cars. To any and all.
I guess we'll go alphabetically again, or Tom, you?
No, you go ahead. I'm mulling this one.
Yeah, I mean, and I have a lot of, the idea of building another mile of highway or concrete in this day and age is terrible. And what's interesting is people are going to Tom talked a lot about the highway trust fund and the taxes. What's been very interesting is people say they want highways, but they don't want to pay for them. What we're getting now are what are called hot lanes or toll lanes, where the highway lobby and these giant infrastructure companies have come in and figured out a way to keep building highways sort of for free. People get highways, but the government doesn't have to pay for it, which is a bit of a digression. What I wanted to say, though, David, is you're absolutely right. The flip side of that, negativity about the highway is, boy, it's a fantastic experience. Driving 870 coming through, these river valleys, these highways that are built right along the edge of a sheer cliff, things like the Eisenhower Pass and tunnels. I mean, there really are engineering feats. You're absolutely right. The U.S. is blessed in all kinds of ways in terms of resources. We're the largest oil producer in the world, so yes, gas is cheap here. But also, it really has been a very impressive feat of engineering that's allowed this to happen, and that we can have, from Florida to Colorado, highways that work and cars that work.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what I was saying, that it's our success and also our failure. It's our great triumph that we could do this. It's that we knew no limits, but it's also it has its negative side to it because we knew no limits. Fortunately, those limits have been imposed at times. But I think that the question about different environments hasn't really been a problem for the United States yet, but it will be in the future. Right now, we're having to raise a lot of our coastal roads. Where I live, I can be isolated in a high tide, in a spring tide, and have been. So that's the downside of where we are. And what it's going to take is, in order to maintain our mobility and maintain what the advantages that highways offer us, we're going to have to spend money on them. And we're in a situation where, in this country, where it's tax has become a four-letter word, which is a great shame. There's the idea of the commonweal has been forgotten.
Dr. Heitman, did you also want to speak to this or not?
I guess one of the things that has just come to mind is, of course, what have we lost? And I address that to Tom with the coming of the interstates, because there's a whole body of literature and mentality about blue highways and what have we lost with the coming of interstate travel. This homogeneous nature of the interstate exit, the McDonald's, Arby's, all the rest. What have we lost by getting away from the two-lane highways? The notion of time and speed and impersonality and the lack of distinctiveness of the American roadside. I guess I throw that back to Tom because he hasn't addressed that. And there is, when we talk about those who are critics of automobility, there's also critics of interstate highway system as well, and what that has done for us. So I just throw it back to you, Tom.
Well, with every my internal pendulum swings back and forth about this, and that's actually one of the reasons why I ended up writing a book about it, because I wanted to explore in myself my ideas about roads and highways and cars, and could we get along without them? I came up with the idea at the end that everybody hates a highway, but they want one 2 miles away from them. An interstate highway, they want one 2 miles away from them. But in addition to that, I would have to say that the interstate highway is a balance, and all of our technology is a balance. You can go into Emerson's journals and read about his being appalled at a train which is traveling at, I think, a speed, I want to say 40 miles an hour, but I'm not even sure it was that much. Being appalled at what he is missing by going at that speed. There's always a trade-off for every technological change, and that's one of the things we have to weigh. There's great parts of this technology, and there are lesser parts. I can drive, as I will be 2 days from now. I can be in Boston in several hours, driving at 65 and 75 miles an hour. At the same time, what am I missing in that? I'm missing the rural roads. When I travel in Maine, where I am right now, I confess I don't take the interstate if I can avoid it. And there are lots of interstate opportunities, but it's just that I want that other experience. Interestingly, there was a head of the Federal Highway Administration named Bert Ptolemy. He never used to take the interstates. He used to take his, I think it was Bert Ptolemy. He used to take other roads because he and his wife liked to go antiquing. And why not? I hope that America is wide enough so that we can still have blue highways. Route 66 is there. It's a really dangerous highway, by the way. More than 1.3 people per 100 million miles gets killed on that highway. And yet it's got its nostalgia. I'm all for that. And I think America is still wide enough to have that opportunity.
Thank you. I have to have a slight.
That's a bad answer. I know it doesn't really get to the part because it gives you both sides, but that's the best I can do.
It's good. Good answer.
I was going to go to a slightly different question, if I may. The age of the truck. Can you talk about the history of the age of the truck, by which I'm going to say, I guess in particular, the freight haulage, the commercial and the industrial infrastructure, and changes that are built around that. This is, in effect, when we talk about the age of the automobile, I think we're often talking about, the person, the individual person taking a ride, the built rise of the suburbs, but the whole age of the truck with everything up, the highways, diesel, containerization. Can you talk about that history, the three of you?
Well, trucks first became significant during the time of World War I. And the first trucks were actually often custom bodies put on large automobile frames like Packards and Peerlesses. And it was trucking that really emerged out of World War I. Until you have the roads, you don't have nearly matters of lots of truck mileage. Roads really come to be, and I mean, Tom knows this more than I do, I'm sure, in the late 1920s, when roads are first rationalized, the federal government, and we start seeing our federal highway system being developed and built. Once you get that, then you get trucking. Trucking also came to be during World War I because the rail network developed gridlock in 1917, 1918. And again, in World War II, roads became very important and trucks became important because of the nature of movement of wartime material, particularly from the Great Lakes to the East Coast and also West Coast operations as well. In terms of post-World War II, I think is where you're really going with trucking. I will defer on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess just to follow up on John, yeah, absolutely. What this idea of the clogged railroads during the First World War is very important, and one of the kind of mythologies of the interstate highway system, or not mythology, but stories, is about Eisenhower and his role in a kind of post-war victory parade, if you will, of all this giant convoy going around the country. That was part of the point, was to sort of celebrate, but also to indicate how much more we needed in terms of roads. The sort of next pivotal moment in that is as because of the way railroads are regulated through the Interstate Commerce Commission, they have a very difficult time competing with trucks as trucks become really a viable long distance solution. And I have a whole chapter in the book about, not to keep plugging, but about that history of trucking, and also about the trucker culture and how it develops out of that. We think of the CB and the trucker hat, all of those things being very rural. It has a lot to do with the way that market develops. That has a lot to do with railroad regulation.
I could add just a little bit to this discussion by talking about just in time. What happened with the trucking industry was that it had become, as we've heard, an important part of the First World War, getting goods from factories inland, if you will, to ocean ports. So, and those trucks, by the way, were as primitive and very primitive in their tires, and they were really pounding up the roads. So they were destroying the roads in the process of getting the material to the ports. But by the end of the Second World War, trucking has come on. One of the reasons why the railroads abandoned passenger traffic was because they had to put more money into freight lines because they were feeling the pressure from trucks. And trucking and long haul trucking really grew with the development of highways even before the interstate. By the time of the interstate, then you have trucks being able to bring oranges from Florida to New York City, and many stories like that. But when you get to just in time, everything changes for trucks, it seems to me. That's an enormous moment, and I'm sure others here who know more about labor history can attest to this. But let me just give a story. When I was a child growing up, you would hear on the radio, so-and-so company has gone on strike. But they still have 45 days worth of supplies, so they can keep on working until then. And so that was the case. But by the time GM goes on strike, or one company, part of GM, goes on strike in the 80s, they can shut down the entire industry in a matter of maybe several days, if not hours. So, for example, just in time has changed the warehousing of America. The interstate highway system is basically one giant rolling warehouse for America. So that, let's say there's a company that's making a car in South Carolina, it might have at this moment car seats for, say, 50 vehicles in its building, but it has car seats for another 500 vehicles on the road that are being delivered to them. This is part of the supply chain, which is, of course, as we have learned recently, can become very fragile. But nevertheless, just in time has changed, and trucking has changed because of that. And our reliance upon trucks for delivery of goods to factories is really extraordinary. And think of what it does for inventory and for labor relations.
Yeah, David, just to answer your point about the question about containerization.
I'm sorry?
I was just following up on one of the things David asked about was containerization, which is, and you start to notice them once you heard the term, the trailers on those trucks, a lot of them carry a box, and that box can be lifted onto a train, lifted off a train onto a boat, and so forth and so on. So those boxes are kind of like the Lego pieces. Whereas in the old days, things were loaded and unloaded on pallets, and guys, sort of on the waterfront was there. So that's called intermodalism. And that's kind of agnostic as to whether you use a train or a truck in terms of what the freight is. So it does allow that flexibility that Tom was talking about.
Thank you. We're getting nearest to the end of our program time. May I ask if I could ask each of you for a concluding remark, a minute or two concluding remark, and then I'll do my own wrap up for the session. In reverse alphabetical order this time, just to change it up. Dr. Lewis, you first, perhaps.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is thank you to my guests here for what's been a great afternoon for me, and given me great pleasure to hear from you and to learn about Henry Ford, to listen to your thoughts. As I was taken with your thoughts about Tesla, especially, and taken with thoughts about Henry Ford. Henry Ford, you confirmed most of my thoughts about Henry Ford. You enlarged my thoughts about Tesla and the Tesla empire, Elon Musk. And so that was very useful to me. I think ultimately we have a question before us as a people as to where we want to go with our infrastructure and how our infrastructure will support our desire for automobility. There's no doubt about it that automobiles, at least at this part of the century, are going to be paramount in our way of mobility. And we have to figure out ways to support that, support it with our dollars, support it with our spirit, and support it with our attitudes towards what we value. I think we as Americans really have to start to think about what we value and why we value things that we have taken for granted, certainly in my lifetime, taken for granted over the last 50 years. So that's those are my concluding thoughts.
Thank you. Dr. Heitman.
Yeah, it's been a great afternoon. As I think about what has been said, I keep thinking back to this elusive factor of personality. When it comes to Ford, when it comes to Tesla and Musk, to what degree are individuals so critical to our future, and who is going to come up in the next 20 years with those innovations that are going to change the world, just as the machine changed the world with Henry Ford beginning in 1908. And so I'm very interested in engineering education. I'm interested in the role of history in engineering education. But what we have are future generations and hopefully some really creative young people who are going to tackle both what we see as challenges in front of us and what we don't see in terms of challenges right now. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. And Dr. Albert.
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me along. I really appreciate it. I know Tom and John's work, and I've read it, so it's great to hear from them in person. And I guess what I try to leave, the people who are attending with is, when you listen to John, you listen to Tom, and hopefully me as well. I hope you get a balanced perspective on the automobile and the highway, because it's funny. I blew up on Twitter, like I have maybe a few hundred followers, but I had 300,000 comments on an article which I tweeted about, an article I wrote called "Give Poor People Cars, Not Bus Drivers," and I was attacked by the mass transit and bicycle. Which I found hilarious on the one hand, right? Most of them are probably bots in any case, but these are supposed to be the gentle, Birkenstock wearing types and all of that, and were they virulent. And by the same token, and I saw some of the questions about EVs, and aren't we really, aren't these fossil fuel powered, and aren't we going to run out of electricity and all that? I feel like we're not very informed on either side of this question about the automobile, the future of the automobile, and the road and the highway. And I think the better you understand the history and more carefully you look at the history, you end up somewhere, I don't want to say better informed, but better able to help in building a future that I think Tom and John are talking about. Like, I listen to Buttigieg, and I feel like all he's doing is, well, he's a politician, but he's pandering, as opposed to really trying to talk about the realities of the role of the automobile, the internal combustion automobile, and the interstate highway system in the history of the United States. So, my profound thoughts.
Thank you so much. Well, I'll do my best for profound thoughts to follow up. First profound thought, thank you all so much. Thank you very much to our three distinguished panelists, and thank you very much to our audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. The questions are by you. And I'm delighted to have the panelists. I'm delighted to have the audience. Thank yous to all. I am going to do a little bit of advertising. First off, if you like this, join the NAS. We support things like this. So if you want to become a member, by all means, everybody and anybody should become a National Association of Scholars member. That's the advertising. To remind people, if you have leftover questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will be delighted to forward any questions you had, any you come up with, to our audience, to our panelists, so that they can have the option of responding to you. Also, this will be available within 24 hours on National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. So you will be able to see this. You'll be able to see everything in our, American Innovations History webinar, and indeed all of our webinars. Speaking of which, if you want to see more things like this, the next American Innovations webinar is November 17th, The Birth of Flight, followed by December 15th, Rocket to the Stars. We are continuing, I must say, with a bunch of transportation-linked webinars. We started with the steamboat, 2 rails, now the automobile, and you can see how we are progressing on to the age of teleport and Star Trek. We also do Great American Literature webinars, as well as other things, but Great American Literature includes, next week, we're discussing Herman Melville's IP, and we'll be doing The Sun Also Rises, not by Melville, on November 8th, and going forward from there. So the point is, you've got a wide variety of options for NAS webinars. That's the advertisements. Thank you again all so very much.